Welcome everybody. It's a lovely day here to have a webinar, and I thank you all for joining us. Today's webinar is the Macro-Infusion process, how to use tree injection best practices, and then equipment maintenance. So this is kind of a follow-up webinar to our earlier webinar this week about Dutch elm disease. So before we get started, we'll just have a quick little housekeeping item here. This webinar is worth 1 ISA CEU. If you did not enter your ISA certification number during your initial registration, or if maybe there's 2 of you or more people viewing it with you, please enter it into the questions box. You can do that now, and I have Peter Vu, who is our Rainbow Scientific Marketing Manager, who is assisting me with this. He is going to take those down, and then we will submit them to the proper people so that you guys get credit for your ISA CEUs. Sometimes it takes a couple weeks for those to show up, so please be patient. If you have any questions, please enter them into the questions box, and we'll address them either at the end of the webinar, or if there's one that is in particular, maybe it's right about what we're talking about or a little deeper into it, I'll take that at that time. And we are going to record this so you can view it afterwards if there's maybe something you felt that you missed, or maybe you would like a little more detail on. And certainly if another question pops up, please don't hesitate to send an email to myself. My name is Chris Haugen. I am the National Accounts Manager for Rainbow Scientific, and I have actually started my career at Rainbow injecting elms for our service company many years ago. So I know this process in and out, and I actually just did some training with a couple companies in the Chicago area earlier this week doing some macro-infusion training. So what I'd like to accomplish for this morning, and if you're on the East Coast, it's now afternoon, but I want you to understand and know the step-by-step process for macro-infusion of Arbotect in this case. But a lot of what we're talking about will carry over if you're doing micro-injections, whether it comes to how you should be drilling, the types of drill bits and the equipment that you're using still carries over, so that we're following those best management practices for tree injection. And then I want to make sure I point out some of the common pitfalls that often cause slow uptake or may cause treatment failures. And these are gleaned from our technical support, kind of what are the common issues that we have that have come around or have been requested of us. And then I'll go through briefly kind of the maintenance of your macro-infusion equipment. And I want to point out, if you look in your toolbox bar over on the right under handouts, I have placed a couple of items there for you. There's the macro-infusion guide in there, which you can download, and it's really a fantastic guide because it walks you through step by step everything you need to do from getting on site to how to dose the tree, and then how to clean up and make sure your applications are productive and go well. And then also I put in there the Arbotect product guide, which has mix rates and things like that, so that you can make sure you're dosing your trees properly. And then of course I want to point out our fantastic technical support staff that we have here at your disposal to help you through these steps, and we staff this with people that have done these, so that when you say I'm having trouble doing X, Y, or maybe Z, they know exactly what you're talking about, and they can walk you through troubleshooting, dosing, or any of the other myriad of issues that may come up out in the field. And we want to make sure that we take care of those as quickly as possible so that you out in the field can get on with your day. So I want to kind of start with what are the steps for the macro-infusion protocol. And the first one, and we'll go through all of these in a little bit greater detail, but the first one, and ultimately the most important step when we're talking about Dutch elm disease, we have to inspect the tree. Now earlier this week, Kent went through kind of how the pathogen works and how it grows within the plant. But what we need to understand is that Arbotect 20S, so the fungicide that we utilize in this process, is only a preventative fungicide. So if we are injecting this fungicide into a tree that already has Dutch elm disease, we're really not going to get the results that we're looking for. And then we've got to make sure that we excavate the root flare. We drill the holes properly, insert our tees to the right depth to actually get to that xylem tissue. We'll go through beginning the infusion and then mixing the chemicals, monitoring, and finally clean up. And then at the end, I'll touch on maintenance as well of your equipment. And I'll just start with also, these are the 7 most common issues we see or hear when we're talking to clients out in the field with, I'm having slow uptake, the tree was going great and then it just kind of stopped. And probably the most important one and the easiest one to troubleshoot is they weren't using a razor sharp drill bit. Change your bits every 5 to 10 trees. I would recommend staying closer to the every 5 trees. Don't spin the bit in the hole, which causes heat, which cauterizes the tissue. The tees aren't placed on the root flare. They're not spaced correctly. They're pushed in too far, or we have clogged tees, or there's unequal pressure inside the harness. And we'll go through all the steps to make sure that these don't happen to you. So a little more on inspecting the tree. Inspect the tree thoroughly for signs and symptoms of the disease. Make sure that you do this on every single tree that you're doing applications to. It's important to look at all of the canopy. I recommend, as if you're doing with any hazardous inspection, and it's good practice to make sure you're inspecting the tree for any hangers or any other potential tree risk issues as good arborists. But also double check you're looking around the neighborhood. See what the neighbor's tree looks like. Just be cognizant of that. And then I always make sure to double check that you're treating an American elm versus any other elm species, whether it's Chinese elm, Siberian elm, English elms, or any of the myriad of other species that you might encounter in the landscape. That is important because American elms have a unique rate. It's the higher rates, whereas every other elm species use the half rate. And then also inspect it, of course, for are there any issues at the root flare that we need to be concerned about. When we're inspecting the tree, note any health issues that the tree may have. This is just a wise practice in case something were to happen later on, so you've covered yourself as far as maybe there's some root decay, there's fungal issues, or also maybe if there's insect issues. Look for signs of decay in the root collar area. This is especially prevalent when we're dealing with trees that are in limited root zones. So in kind of the boulevard setting where there's a sidewalk on one side and the street on the other, as these trees grow up and get bigger, sometimes when they remove or replace the sidewalk, that root collar can get damaged and you can have decayed pockets. And then I recommend at this point also starting to fill your reservoir with water. I recommend doing this to start, especially if you're pulling water from maybe the homeowner, because sometimes they don't have the best water pressure, so it can occasionally take a while to actually fill up 40 to 60 gallons of water. So I'd start doing that right now just so you have it, and make sure you place the barrel where you want it to be, because obviously if you fill up 60 gallons of water in a barrel or 55, and you try moving that, it won't go well for you. And if you are using a 2-pump setup for trees that are the 50 inches and larger, these are the big daddies, I would recommend making sure that you start filling both of those at that point as well. Now, at that point, after we've done our initial inspection, we want to make sure we excavate and clean those root flares off. Macro-infusion must be done 8 to 10 inches below the top of the root flares for 3 reasons. The first being we get far better lateral movement of the fungicide, so of our Arbotect, throughout the entire canopy. You'll have faster wound closure than on the trunk tissue, and there's a much greater surface area for tea placement. So a little bit more on this. So we are in theory painting the interior of that tree with fungicide with Arbotect. So the more product we can have distributed out into those xylem cells, which are essentially just straws moving north to south, the more we have them placed out, the better coverage we're going to have, not only in the trunk tissue, but when you think about all of that spreading canopy, we want to make sure we have that entirely covered and painted inside with fungicide. So it's going to move east to west among those cells much more efficiently once it's up in the canopy if there aren't any large pockets missing at the bottom. You'll have better wound closure in the trunk tissue as well. So if you've ever seen maybe an elm that you're not able to inject into the root flare, maybe due to a hardscape or something like that, those holes, because that corky outer tissue isn't actually growing, it's just kind of existing on the outside. That's not where the actively growing tissues are. It's not going to heal itself. So you'll always have these wounds inside of the corky bark tissue. And it's much harder to get teas placed adequately in that corky tissue. So if we're looking in the furrows of the bark, it's very hard to place teas inside of that. You'll find that you're having more teas pop off, more leaks and issues like that up in the trunk tissue. It's much smoother. There's a much easier, the tissue is more supple. It's much easier for you to inject into that root flare. When we're excavating, the primary reason we want to make sure we clean these root flares off with a nice hand trowel and a brush is, one, so we're not damaging that tissue we want to inject into with a large shovel, but we're also able to remove any of that mineral soil that is on top of it. That's important because we don't want to get soil matter into our injection site, so into the actual trunk tissue or root tissue. But also it ensures that our drill bits don't dull faster than they should be. Drill bits were meant to drill into wood, not soil. And that's why we recommend changing your drill bits every 5 to 10 trees, because there is soil particulate matter in there that can cause little microscopic nicks and dings in those bits over time and will cause less than ideal infusion sites, because we want to cut those xylem tubes or those xylem straws versus tearing at them. When we're drilling, and I'll spend a little bit of time here on this, we want to use a very sharp, a razor sharp high helix drill bit. The drill bit size is 15/64 of an inch, and that is to correspond to the Macro-Infusion tees. I recommend changing your drill bit at the longest interval every 10 trees, and I would recommend closer to the 5. Now the reason for this is, as I mentioned just previous, there's a lot of soil matter that gets down there, and it can cause dulling of the drill bits. But we want to make sure that those bits are razor sharp so that when we drill into those xylem straws, we are cutting that tissue. Imagine, if you will, you're trying to cut a plastic straw with this drill bit. If you were to try to do it with a dull drill bit, what happens is it just twists and rips apart the straw versus cutting it. Now if you tried to use that straw after the dull one, it's going to be really hard to drink out of that. That's why we really recommend using a razor sharp drill bit. A frequent question we get is, can I sharpen these drill bits? We don't recommend sharpening these drill bits. I understand that it seems like it can be a large cost of replacing your drill bits, but if you consider the amount of time that an applicator might spend waiting at a tree for a uptake, the price of changing your drill bits every 5 trees really doesn't become that much of an issue. So make sure you change your drill bits, and if you start with one drill bit maybe at the end of the day, and you obviously still want to use it the next day, make sure you put it somewhere that it's going to stay clean. It's not going to get nicked and dinged. So more importantly, don't just throw it in the bottom of your bucket and then pile a bunch of trowels and other tools on top of it. Put it inside the sleeve of your bucket, maybe container, or keep it in the truck with you, in the truck cab or something like that, because these are, in a way, these are your most important piece of equipment that you have with you in this process. So take care of them as such. When we're drilling, we want to make sure we're drilling perpendicular to the root flare surface. So we want to intersect and make a 90-degree angle with whatever tissue we're trying to infuse into. So we don't want to drill at a steep angle into the tissue. We want to make a 90-degree angle, clean holes and clean cuts into that root tissue. And then drill 1 inch past the bark into the xylem. So what we want to see, and when we do training on this, is we want to see some nice, bright, white, supple wood chips coming out of the hole. And an easy way to know if your drill bit is getting dull, when those chips are being exited from the hole, if you're getting chips that immediately fall apart or are short and broken, your drill bit isn't actually cutting it. It's actually tearing at those tissues. You should be getting 1-inch long chips out of this that you can easily pick up, and certainly they're fragile, but you should be able to pick them up and manipulate them. And another common issue I'll see with a lot of newer applicators is that they have a tendency to spin the drill bit inside the hole, and they'll move in and out in a kind of a back and forth motion a few times into the hole. The drill bit is designed to remove that tissue cleanly, so you should only have to drill in once and pull it back out. And you want to just keep it moving in and out in an easy, consistent fashion. The enemy of this process is causing undue heat. So you've got metal drilling and spinning in a small hole. If you spin that drill bit in there, it causes a lot of heat, which can actually cauterize that xylem tissue inside there, which once it's cauterized, it's not going to be uptaking any of our product. So we want to just move in an easy, consistent motion in and back out. And I do want to touch on this. It certainly isn't an advertisement for any any drill manufacturer, but I do want to touch on the importance of having a good quality drill. I don't have a strong opinion whether you choose to use a battery-powered one. I have seen users use gas, like the steel drills. It seems a little ungainly, but certainly they can be done, or a plug-in. I personally, I use a Makita lithium-ion drill. The main important thing that you have with these, if you're using a drill, is you want to have plenty of torque and plenty of power, and plenty of longevity in the battery if it is battery powered. What you don't want to have is the power running out, so you're struggling to cut through that tissue. I recommend a good quality drill, one that is durable, because consider where you're using it. You're using it out in the field, in the dirt, in the soil, where it's dusty. There might be a little bit of moisture, and it could fall off the back of a tailgate, things like that. So have a good quality drill. And drills are very flexible in what they can do, obviously, so they'll get used. But make sure that you do have a good quality drill. And just make sure that it's durable. If you have a battery-operated one, I'd recommend having the car charging plug-in as well. And then we're going to touch a little bit on where to drill the holes. So do not drill into or below dead tissue. So you can see here in this picture here where we're drilling. We've excavated the root flare, we've exposed it, and there's a definite color change in that tissue from the reddish to the white. We are drilling into the root flare tissue, but we're not drilling into deep valleys or sunken areas where there might be, we're not totally sure how that xylem cells are arranged. And we want to space those holes about 4 to 6 inches apart. A good rule of thumb, no pun intended, is your thumb distance to your pinky. And that's a general rule. Certainly if you have a very large root flare, you could be closer to the 4-inch spacing. Or if you have maybe one where there's limited, or there's the decay pocket and you have to go 6 inches apart, that's just fine. But we want to make sure that we're sticking pretty close to that 4 to 6 inch distance apart. And then a good question to point out kind of where do we want to infuse into. So here we have where we do want to drill into it. We want to drill into the root flare where it's exposed. And this happens to be on an oak tree, but the point is still the same. We want to be drilling into the main primary roots and avoiding these deep cavities. And often when people do drill into these cavities, what happens is you have a lot of teeth that will pop off, so you'll be losing material and product. But also sometimes we have really slow uptake because that tissue isn't really distributing into the interior of the tree all that efficiently. A general rule of thumb, and this is in the application guide, is use 1.5 sites for every dBH inch. And that's a general rule. So a 30-inch tree would have about 45 infusion sites. A 50-inch elm would be around 75. And typically elms have, just due to their kind of growing nature, they have pretty nice root flares, so usually having this 1.5 sites for every dBH inch isn't a problem. And certainly if just the root flare allows, and it has plenty of it, use 2. It just allows for better distribution and faster uptake. When we're inserting our teas, we want to make sure that we're checking all of them for any soil or sediment. This happens particularly after infusions where the teas are moist and there's moisture on them, and as you're pulling them out, they get a little bit of sediment on them. And then they just get put into the barrel. We want to make sure that when we're putting them back into the tree the next time, that we don't have soil in here. So in the bottom picture here, you can see there's a little bit of soil particulate matter at that very end where all the fungicide mix is supposed to come out of. If there's sediment on there, what happens when we insert that into the tree? It all goes into the xylem cells, or it blocks that off. So we want to avoid that. So I recommend using a tarp. Keep your tubes and teas on there while you're inserting them in, and you can just slide the tarp around as you insert them in to keep them clean. And maybe at the end of the job site while you're watering the grass, just to water it in, maybe just give the tubes and teas a quick once over with the hose. Insert all your teas. You don't have to push too deep. You can just more or less push these in and then give it a light tap with a small mallet if you need to. And what we're targeting here is that xylem ring. In this spring, we've had, for the most part, quite a bit of rain, which means the elms have put on typically pretty nice spring xylem wood. And that's what we're trying to inject into. So the heartwood isn't conductive. It's not going to be moving any of the material around for us. So we want to make sure that we're targeting that xylem tissue. And I'll kind of, if you can see here in that tea, there's that long opening inside of the tube, or the tea, pardon me. That's where the actual fungicide is going to be flowing out of. So if we push that orifice beyond the xylem cells, it's really not interfacing with any of the xylem. So it's going to slow uptake down. It's just going to have to diffuse through just sort of moisture content from the heartwood into the xylem tissue. This is an adequate, an ideally placed tea. You'll notice that it's not pushed in. When I come to sites and I see teas that are pushed all the way into the tubing, so they're flush, that's way too deep. It means two things. First, you're drilling really deep, which you don't need to do. You're drilling past that 1-inch depth, but you're also pounding those teas in much too hard, and you're going to be pushing them past those xylem conductive cells. So you do want to see a little bit of it here, and I want to point out that the teas, while they are well seasoned and used quite a bit, they're still in their shape. They're not twisted and bent up and gnarled. And when we're placing our tubes and tea setups, why would I show this picture? It looks pretty benign. I'm a real stickler for creating this serpentine pattern of our tubes and teas. I do this for a couple reasons. The first being it looks professional, and it's easy for me to visually see if maybe a tube or a tea pops off or is leaking. It's easy to see if there's any air bubbles in the harness. And what it also does is it makes sure you have even pressure throughout the entire harness. If we have kind of just a random arrangement of our tubes and teas, it causes pressure pockets in there, which can cause uneven distribution of the product, which ultimately slows your uptake and distribution down. So I recommend have your teas facing north to south. It creates a nice, easy serpentine pattern, and it's easy to work with. So once we have all of our tubes and teas set up, and we have the harness set up, and it's attached to the reservoir, we want to start the infusion. But we want to make sure we do it before we have any of our mixed product in here. The reason for that, so if we have any leaks that we have to troubleshoot or problem areas, we can make sure that we're doing that without fungicide in there. When we start that, we want to make sure we're getting all the air pockets out. So I recommend pull a tea on the opposite side of the pump, and what happens then is all of your water and all of the air pockets will flow to that open area, so you have a complete and an even distribution of water within the system. Bleeding the air out is important because it causes air pockets, and the air pockets will prevent the product from evenly distributing. You can have one side that maybe gets a third less of the product or even more. It just makes it much more difficult to ensure that you have even and complete distribution of the fungicide. This is an example of a site where I wouldn't be happy with what I see. you can see in here there's a large amount of air pockets that are quite large, and it's driven by there's a strange assortment of how the tubes and tees are arranged. If we were to rearrange these tubes and tees, I think we'd have a much better time bleeding the air out and having an even and consistent pressure. And which I should reiterate, we want to keep the pump at about 15 to 20 psi. The reason for that, we're not forcing the fungicide mixture into the tree. We're merely bringing it evenly to the tree's tissues and allowing the tree to do the work for us. Just passively bring that tissue up into the canopy. If we have it much higher than 15 to 20, you'll start seeing a lot of tees popping out. You'll be losing product, things like that. So keep it at 15 to 20 psi. When we're mixing, make sure we have the proper PPE on. So that means gloves, long sleeve shirt, pants, eye protection. And it is measured in ounces. So either if you have an ounces graduated cylinder or mixing cup, or do the conversion into mils. But make sure that you're mixing it in an area that is safe in a way. And inspect your product. Certainly you want to be using product that you purchased this year, or if you purchased it last year or the year before. But if it's older than a year and it's been opened, I would not recommend using that product. And make sure if it is older than a year, just double check to make sure that it looks brown. There's no particulate matter in there. There's no odd funky formations inside of it. And then once we pour it in to our barrel with our water, take a water sample out of it and make sure you're inspecting it. This is what an ideal mix should look like. You can see here the gentleman here is Paul Schonecke. He is our plant healthcare and inject care manager for our service company here in Minneapolis. You can see that he's able to see through the mixture there. You can see the truck in the background beyond it. It's a good, clean mix. There's no precipitate. There's no other issues mixing with it. This is an ideal mix. If for some reason you do see precipitate, which is on the right here, it'll look kind of like curdled milk. If you're seeing thousands of little bubbles in your barrel, that is not precipitate. That is probably your filter cap on the pump is probably loose, so it's kind of pulling in a little bit of air. But if you know you have hard or high pH water, Arbotect doesn't react all that well to it. You'll see it precipitate and separate. This will slow your uptake down, and it'll cause uneven distribution within the tree. There's a couple ways you can mitigate this. The first being run your water through a deionizer or pull it from a different source that has really high quality water. Or if you're in the field and in a pinch, you can add muriatic acid to the solution at 1 ounce per 6 gallons of water. To be honest, I've never had to add an ounce per 6 gallons of water. That would mean your water is very high in pH, and I wouldn't touch that water then, perhaps. But that would be one thing. And then I want to touch a little bit on water quality. I discourage people from using water that's pulled from their spray tanks, primarily because a lot of times there's a little bit of residue or residual product or fertilizer in those spray tanks. If you are going to be doing that, it is absolutely crucial that you thoroughly clean out that spray tank. Make sure that you've put the tank cleaner in there a few times and really get it so that it's actually truly clean. So I talked about all of these items. We have the pitfalls to macro-infusion. The big ones that I see here are not changing your drill bits. I've seen a lot of rusty and bent up drill bits, and also it's the drill bits. If you're purchasing them at a local hardware store, they may be sharp, but they're not quite the same. They don't have that high helix, razor sharp cutting edge on all sides. So I would recommend purchasing them from Rainbow or a distributor that you're getting the high helix drill bits. Drill your tees proper or your holes properly. Place them into the root flare. I see really slow uptake when people try to go above the root flare into the trunk tissue. There aren't enough tees, or they're spaced incorrectly. They're pounded in too far. there's a lot of sediment on the tees, or there's unequal pressure inside the harness. These are kind of the big ones that I see for slow uptake. While we're and then when we're monitoring, it is an active process. We want to make sure that we're checking for leaks, and I often use sound, the sound of the pump running, to kind of know if maybe there's a leak that occurred or a tee that popped out. And while it's going, you can start putting away your other equipment, whether it's putting away the drill and all those things, the product, and start filling out your paperwork. And it should take, somewhere around 45 to 60 minutes. I've seen pretty good uptake for the most part here this year due to we had a lot of rain, which is ideal. But it is an active process, so make sure that you are monitoring your infusion. And once we're done, remove the tees first, and then when I'm doing this, I often will kind of rinse them off just briefly with the hose if it's available to me, and then I'll put them in the bottom of the barrel. I like to keep all my equipment together and then put the pump and the harness tubing on top of that. So it means it's all ready to go, it's easy to take out, and it's easy to manage at the next job site. And I'll put this up here. Certainly I'm available, but also so is our technical staff if you want troubleshooting or help in the field. When we're done and we replace the turf, I typically recommend rewatering that turf that you've watered in. It's a good idea to keep that turf going, especially people like to have their really nice sod right next to the root flare, unfortunately. Just do your best to kind of put that back in one piece. And we'll finally here touch on equipment maintenance and kind of what you should do to keep your equipment running in tip-top shape. A little bit here on the pump itself, the pump housing. The first thing, and I'll touch on this a little bit momentarily, is the filter. The filter is the overlooked part of this equipment. Make sure you're checking it, but there's also an O-ring inside that filter housing. If you lose the O-ring, and this can happen when you're checking it, what happens is you'll start pulling a lot of air into the system, which really slows the infusion down, and you can check for this in your barrel. You'll see in the return component, it'll come out looking real hazy and kind of cloudy. That's what that is. So just have that replacement there, and make sure the pressure gauge works. This I see happens a lot on older pumps where maybe it's been around for maybe 5 to 10 years. The gauges don't work, but the pump does. It's really nice to have a working gauge so you can really tell what pressure you're at, because a lot of times people, when they have a non-functioning gauge, will actually have the PSI much too low because they don't want tees popping off, so it causes them to have really slow uptake time. And then the pump itself. If you're using this pump on a daily basis for maybe a month or two in the summer, you have a lot of elm trees, and it's hot outside, the ambient air temperature can get up into the 90s or something like that. It's sunny. That pump can get really warm. So every 2 or 3 years, I would definitely recommend just replacing that pump. It's a small investment, but it means that all of those diaphragms will be working properly. You'll get even, consistent pressure in there. It'll prime itself nicely. Just something to keep in mind. But they don't need to be greased or anything like that. I would not recommend digging in or taking apart that pump. It's a very complex piece of equipment. Not for the faint of heart to manually replace themselves or to troubleshoot themselves. A little more on the filter. The couple things I like to check: does the filter have any damage? This often happens when people are checking it. It accidentally gets stepped on or something like that. Make sure that it doesn't have any beyond the filter, the holes in the filter. Make sure the filter housing isn't broken. Is it rusted beyond usability? This happens, I see, in a lot of older pumps, or where people use a lot of muriatic acid frequently. That pump will, or the filter itself will rust. And then on a daily basis, just check: is there sediment, grass, or other detritus in the filter? And don't rinse the filter back into the barrel. It seems like a little thing, but I do see this occasionally. Rinse it out in the grass. And then just make sure, is the filter even there? If you don't have a filter, what happens is you'll pull in whatever sediment or grass clippings are inside your barrel, and the barrel is open. so you can have leaves that'll fall in there or pollen or things like that. So just make sure that it is in there. And at the end of the year, I recommend people cycle some clean water, or whenever you're done for the season, cycle clean water through your pump. Do a few cycles through there to really rinse it out and get it all clean. And then at the end of the year, take the filter off. So take the housing off and set that, even if you have it in the same box or something, allow that filter and the filter housing to actually dry out for the winter. A little bit on your harness and tubes. The harness and tubing do take quite a good beating over the course of the year because they are out in the sediment and the dirt and they're being pushed into trees. Make sure that those connections on the T's and the tubing is still functional. I see a lot of tubing that's pretty yellowed or discolored or browned out. What happens is it loses its elasticity, and you'll have more tubing that'll pop off of T's. Make sure the T's aren't gnarled or broken and bent from years of being pushed into trees and taken out. And then also sunlight on plastic, over a period of years can cause them to become brittle. And then you'll have more T's that'll just break off at the neck. A little thing on the black harness T's, those often, people seem to step on those quite frequently and they get cracked or something like that. Make sure you actually have those and try to avoid using the white T's as your splitters for your harness connections. That really creates an inefficient system. So just inspect those, and then at the end of the year I take them in a barrel and I'll put a little bit of warm water and Dawn dish detergent and just kind of give them a good once over with a brush just to kind of clean them off and get them clean and nice and looking for the next year, and then store them in some place that's dry so that they're ready to go for the next year. I wouldn't store them in the barrel that you've used for applications unless the barrel's been cleaned and the T's have been cleaned. And I want to wrap up here. So we've kind of gone through everything from setting up the equipment to how the process begins and some of the pitfalls that you'll see or have issues with, and through maintaining the Macro-Infusion equipment. And with that, I will take questions now. And just as a quick reminder, there is the two in your dashboard here. There's two handouts. There is the Arbotect product guide and the Macro-Infusion application guide. They're really nice tools to have out in the field to help answer any of those questions that you might have about the process. And we do have videos on YouTube that walk you through all of it step by step as well. It doesn't look like there are any questions here. It looks like I did much too good of a job explaining the process from start to finish. With that, make sure you please enter your ISA number in the box there so we can make sure you get your credits. And with that, I thank you all for your attention. And if you're free tomorrow, Patrick Anderson, one of our territory managers or our technical experts, is going to be doing a nice webinar on New England scale insects and hemlock woolly adelgid, which should be a really fascinating delve into that topic. So I thank you and have a wonderful morning and afternoon for all of you.